And good evening and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where truth is our mission, reality our realm, said as we see it and frankly as well. I'm Joe Spina, and our boy Paul Crowley, the illustrious Paul Crowley, is in Washington, D.C. as we speak, looking after the interests and advocating for the greater Lynn senior citizens, and I think that's a noble thing. Now, in search of truth, I had to find someone that could possibly take Paul's place, which is difficult, frankly, but I have with us Timothy Timothy Quigley from Salem State College, professor, adjunct professor there, and also at
Wentworth,
and who's written a marvelous novella that we're going to get into, and it's entitled Kissing the Hag. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, listen, there's a little portrait of him up there, and if you take a look, and they can get in touch with you at, I believe, www.salemstate.edu/T Quigley. Is that correct?
Well, timothyquigley.org is probably better.
Okay.
That's my personal website.
All right. And they can also, if they want to email you, it's at timothy.quigley@salemstate.edu. Is that correct? And they can get a hold of, and you're also on Amazon.com, right? If they want to get the novella.
Exactly.
So, let me get right to it. You, Timothy Quigley, deftly interweaves Celtic. My son told me I have to say Celtic, not Celtic. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Celtic mythology, Christian dogma, street smarts, New Age drunk talk, whatever that means, and madman's ravings to create a deeply compassionate portrait of a jaded, disillusioned man's struggle to get his life back. Is that about the essence of...
I think so. You hit just about every note there.
I did. Now, what I'm fascinated by, most books are autobiographical. Is this?
Semi, yes.
So many of these instances...
I like to kid and say it's oh so loosely based.
Oh, so loosely based. I like that. I found a lot of great truths in reading it over, and that's not to throw bouquets at you. It was just a good, solid read, and I think there's a lot to be gleaned out of it. It's ironic that my boy Paul Crowley is the director of GLIS, which is an agency dedicated to, elderly people who have problems, addiction problems, as you well know, right? And a place to go, a meal to get. And you actually worked at a homeless shelter on a couple of occasions.
I did.
And that was the background?
It served as the backdrop for the story, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the story. It takes place over an evening.
Yes.
Go from there.
Well, it takes place in the course of an evening. The protagonist, Julian, his life has come to a standstill since the suicide of his brother. He worked at a shelter when he was younger and in college. And after his brother's death, he quits his job and goes back to work at the shelter. He has a need to be around suffering and around other broken people.
But he himself was broken because he was an alcoholic himself, was he not?
He was.
So he can identify with, in many ways.
Right. He had, the character had gotten sober before working at the shelter the first time, back when he was an undergraduate student, and he worked the graveyard shift at the shelter. At that point, he was sober.
Let me get your biog out a little bit. Norwich Military Academy?
Well, Norwich University, Vermont College Graduate School, civilian.
Okay. And literature?
Writing, MFA in writing.
And you also have written a number of short stories that have been well received.
Yep, I have a handful of publications in literary magazines and a few literary prizes as well.
And a lot of students, I suspect from the Greater Lynn area, and they've passed through your, been mentored by you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the rest of it. Look, I find addiction to be a serious problem, particularly now with opiates.
Absolutely.
Which ultimately ends up leading to despair, and in some instances, suicide, like your brother. deinstitutionalization when you were a young man, a lot of that impacted the homelessness that you, on the homeless shelters you dealt with.
Absolutely.
Give us a little flavor of what it was like working and with your clients, because in some ways it's almost going back to childhood. These folks tend to regress. That make any sense to you at all?
Yeah, regress, I'm not so sure about regression, but there's definitely when you're homeless, you have a loss of rights, so to speak, you
Right.
know, and you have to abide by someone else's rules all the time. And, you know, a shelter, a facility that houses homeless people have a lot of restrictions and regulations and rules the residents have to abide by that can further sort of augment that sense of not having rights. So it becomes an issue of self-pride too, you know, to add insult
Yeah.
to injury.
That's an interesting paradox. So you're saying, here's someone that's lost all sense of rules, it's almost without structure, now put into a place that's overly structured.
Right.
How'd they adjust to that?
Well, sometimes not very well.
Yeah. That's the point, yeah.
The shelter where I worked was a wet shelter, meaning that we couldn't deny somebody who was under the influence of something.
Which means they could come in drunk.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which, of course, you know, created a whole host of problems that further required, you know, restrictions. The mix in the shelter itself was mentally ill, addicted individuals. Some were displaced because of poverty or, you know, financial situations.
Yeah, I want to get to that because early on in the book, before you went back to the shelter, I don't know when the crisis took place in your life, of the protagonist, Julian, referring to you.
Right.
You're standing in the middle of a restaurant that you managed and was doing quite well in, and you're looking at these patrons who are all upset because the salad may have come out a little later than it should have, etc. And they're kind of petty, and you felt like standing in the middle and yelling to all of them. Here you are, wait, this is a crisis, your salad isn't the way you want it. How about poverty? How about racism? How about suicide? Have you ever thought of these things? You wanted to yell that out early on. That, to me, is part of what you're trying to say in the book about what's important.
Right.
Important values.
Exactly.
And
Perspectives.
keep going with it. You know, I'm not the only guy here to talk. You know,
Right.
it's your book.
Well, I think that the protagonist was feeling something that I felt in my own life. You know, the book is autobiographical. My brother did take his own life. I did work at a shelter when I was an undergraduate, and I worked the graveyard shift like Julian. My life did not come to a standstill after my brother died. I was actually catapulted forward, but I did have that strong sense of which most people can relate to when they go through a tragedy. The perspective of what's truly important in life, you know, comes into place.
I think that's the important part of why you folks out there would benefit from getting a hold of Kissing a Hag and reading it, because it does go to what you're talking about, what's important in life. It makes
Right.
distinctions.
Exactly.
You know-
Exactly. And some of the things that on a day-to-day basis that we find disappointing or even catapult to crisis level aren't all that detrimental in the end, you know.
Why did you decide to write this book? I mean, what were you aiming at?
Know what I was aiming at. I think perhaps one of the goals in the book was to humanize homelessness, to sort of put a face on it.
Yeah.
To give readers a sense that all these people that dot these sidewalks and shelters in our landscapes, are people, and they have lives, and they had childhoods,
And they have value.
and they have value. Absolutely,
And you learned
absolutely
a lot from them working there.
Exactly.
One of your heroes, Rosie, is a fascinating character.
Right.
And I want you to talk about, because she is, quote unquote, the hag,
The hag.
that you kissed.
Right.
And in kissing that hag, and let me go to a quote, by the way. It says, listen to this, folks, because I think it's so profound. You got to be happy with absolutely nothing before you see the beauty in anything. Rosie taught you that.
Yes.
And she's a broken person.
Yep.
Tell me about, and she was a little Irish girl, right, with the
Right.
brogue. And she told you a little, this is the Celtic mythology,
Right.
a little story about a hag at a well. I'd like you to
Exactly.
tell the folks out there what it's about, that little
Sure.
story.
The hag at the well. In Celtic mythology, the goddess appears to man and takes many different forms. She is always presenting him with a gift or gifts that he can't achieve or attain without her intervention. This particular embodiment of her is the proverbial loathsome woman, the hag, a hideous creature who's guarding a well in the Irish countryside when the Irish king's 4 sons are out hunting and they get lost. They are dying of thirst in the woods, and each one sets out to find water. Each one comes upon the hag by the well, and she says, you can have as much water as you want, but first you must bestow a kiss on my cheek. And every one of the sons is repulsed by her and comes back and tells the other brothers that he could find no water, until Niall, the last son, goes out and he confronts the same hag by the well, and he's so happy to see her, he jumps off his horse and he hugs her and kisses her, and she transforms into a beauty, and all the kingdom and everything is his, because he was able to see the beauty within the hideousness, which is the essence of that truth. This version of the hag was taken from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
And that's basically what you're talking about transformation that took place within Julian's soul, so to speak.
Exactly. And some lessons that he needed to learn, and it was through his intervention with this bag lady, Rosie, that he was, set free from what was binding him at the time.
In my culture, I'm of Sicilian extraction, an island people like the Irish, and we have our little mythologies. And Pedro, if you can find my version, even though I have your name on it, of the hag, right, kissing the hag, and you can't see it, I can't see it, but I'm hoping our viewers can see it. The strega, you corrected me on that, an Irish
well,
boy.
the strega is right. It's somebody who practices stregeria, which is the Italian witchcraft.
Sicilian.
From what I understand.
Yes, you're right.
Yes, make that distinction, Sicilian.
Yeah.
Which I'm certainly not a scholar on Italian witchcraft, nor am I a scholar on Celtic mythology, but I do know that they, in common, they're related to a lot of the pagan doctrines where there are female deities.
Very important.
Very
Great
important.
Point.
Yeah. And these are tied to nature. I think that it's what intrigues me about the Italian witch. Even I live in Salem, where witchcraft is obviously very prevalent. The history of Salem and the witchcraft trials. There are many who practice witchcraft there today. We have this sort of proverbial archetype of the hag on a broomstick, right? That's got some sort of ill will or nefarious intentions. When in Italian witchcraft, as well as in what's practiced in Salem today, there's nothing nefarious about it.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, they're good witches.
They're good witches.
Yep.
It's Wiccan. It's all tied to those same pagan beliefs, the connection to nature, harnessing these powers for goodwill and so forth.
Well, I mean, if you look at Greek mythology, I mean, it's fundamentally the same. And what fascinates me is, and the reason why I mentioned, and I threw up this edited version of quite beautiful women, as opposed to being hags,
Right.
in that proverbial sense, because I tend to think that the devil, or evil, or whatever you want to call it, the negative, certainly does not look like a hag.
Right.
Because who would kiss it, so to speak, right? So to be able to suck you into this terrible deal, right, where you sell your soul, you got to be awfully attractive. You got to, I'd go running to those gals on my page. I don't know what I could possibly kiss the hag that you're talking about, that the king's last son kissed. I'm not sure I could do that. Although, what a benefit he got, huh?
Yeah.
Out of the whole thing. Battles, you wrote. Battles, and this is you discussing with Rosie, because,
Right.
And let me ask, before I get into that part, I noticed that on your, if you could take a flash at this, Pedro, and the cover of Kissing the Hag, you see a silhouette of an individual with a cigarette, which I quit 2 years ago, by the way, with a backdrop of a, concrete shelter type of building. And I was wondering whether, and I noted, reading it, there was always getting together having a cigarette. Everybody's having a cigarette. Is a cigarette a connector? Is it a metaphor for a pacifier, so to speak, to keep the pressure down for these broken people? I wanted to ask you that.
Well, I think that it is, and it can definitely work that way. Due to fire codes and no smoking policies today, there's no smoking in shelters. There's no smoking in that shelter. So it puts sort of a strain on these people who are addicted to something, and they're going through the night without access to anything. But in my story, it becomes a point where they gather, either out in the alleyway or on the stairs, where Julian lets some of the residents smoke in the middle of the night, because, as he puts it, they're jonesing for something else. He might as well let them have a cigarette. It's sort of a jumping off point for them,
Exactly.
conversation-wise, connecting. And it's during these smoking breaks with Rosie that he has these discussions that involve, her idea of spirituality, and tells him of the hag
And his journey to
And his
find himself,
journey,
yeah.
yeah.
And this is the one I wanted to talk about, because in some of those discussions on those cigarette breaks, battles are won not with force or conflict, and I have an ellipse here, but the gentleness of the heart. Speak to that, if you would.
Well, that's from the myth of the hag from Canterbury Tales. I think that it's a very wise proverb.
It is.
That perhaps if we opened our hearts a little bit more, we'd be able to see some more viable solutions into some of the conflicts that we have in our life, whether they're internal conflicts or they're external and bloody, involve war.
So Kissing the Hag speaks to that. That's one of the
Yes.
goals, one of the ends of the book. That's one of the, any good piece of literature has a story to tell, has a
Right.
moral to teach, a lesson to be learned. And part of the lesson to be learned in reading The Hag, or what I learned in reading The Hag, is that point. Perhaps we ought to look to the gentleness of the heart and to resolve these conflicts and these forces, negative forces that are around today.
Yeah, and the ills of society too. There's a lot of problems today with poverty, with homelessness, with addiction, and I think that if we took a more compassionate approach, we might find more of a solution. I mean, look what the police chief in Gloucester has been doing with drug addicts.
I'm glad you brought that up. Good. Keep going with it. Tell us about that.
Well, instead of throwing them in jail, they're offering them treatment. it's been very successful, and even they're talking about using it as a national model, and it's very compassionate approach, other than just kicking the addict to the curb or throwing them in a cell, where a lot of these addicted people don't get any treatment whatsoever while they're incarcerated, and they wonder why they're repeat offenders.
And you can speak to that because you actually work in a homeless shelter.
Right.
And let me give you a little insight. One of our directors, producers, along with the great Pedro Diaz, is a fellow named Dave Riley, who brought this exact subject up to me back a month or so ago about the success of that Gloucester program, and I'm very glad you brought that up. Truth, always the hardest to hear. Another one of the great pearls I got from your book. Go.
Well, I think that there are some quotes at the beginning and the end of the book by E. E. Cummings, and it's from a speech from an unfinished play of his, and it's very, very existential, and it's about the voices inside you, and the voices that we listen to and we try to listen to, the voices that we hear when we look inward. And how the ones that we should be listening to are usually the most difficult ones to discern.
And it's true. And you talk a lot about sound, and you talk about silence louder than sound.
Right.
That's an interesting play on words.
That
Could you give me a little insight into that?
Sure. Well, when we are silent, we're alone with ourselves, or connecting as well with what we view as a higher consciousness, a higher power, what have you. It does hark back to that play by E. E. Cummings as well too, because that was in my parents' library. It was in an anthology called "This Is My Best" that was published in the early 1940s, and great literary figures of the time were asked to contribute a piece of work that they considered to be emblematic of their best work. And E. E. Cummings, being the oddball that he was, in his foreword, and they were asked to write a foreword to why they chose that particular piece, he said, "Please honor my contribution with a bit of silence. Silence is lively, deathful is double talk."
I like that.
And then silence. And in this speech, which I tried to connect thematically to what Julian was going through on this night, the breaks in it, he just has the word silence and an ellipsis.
Exactly.
And here Julian was in this dark night of the soul, so to speak. And you think of the night shift at a shelter, and it's dark and it's mostly quiet. I mean, it wasn't always quiet. Sometimes it was rather tumultuous.
It's punctuated by a lot of drama.
Yeah.
And that was also
But he was alone with himself and alone with his thoughts.
He was. And he wanted to read another one of the great Lost Generation writers. You mentioned E. E. Cummings, but there was also Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. And I was asking you about that off camera because Julian seemed to view The Great Gatsby as being representative of the excesses and decadence of the Roaring '20s.
Right.
And whether that had any connection to the way Julian might have viewed contemporaneous.
Well, I'm sure you could draw some connections, definitely, and perhaps some irony with the excesses against society versus, the sort of the degradation against society. What I was doing there was just sort of tipping my hat to one of my favorite writers, Fitzgerald.
Well, that was nice of you. I'm going to tip my hat to one of my favorite writers sitting across from me.
Oh, thank you.
Sacrifice. Sacrifice equals, within the stories blended in, the highest form of prayer and compassion. I found that interesting.
I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic schools. Certainly sacrifice is a big message of Christ's life. You know, he
Yes.
sacrificed for us. We are supposed to imitate him, and we can sacrifice for our brothers and sisters, etc. You grow up in your, for a lack of better term, spoon-fed philosophies and religions of our parents, et cetera, et cetera. All of us get to a point where we go out and we search for our own truths. I looked at a lot of different religions, philosophies, Eastern, Western, et cetera. And, I found that there were a lot of concurrent truths in all of them.
So there's
and
a
one of
connection.
them was sacrifice.
And sacrifice was always in them.
Yeah.
See, now that takes care of two of the ingredients that you wove into the story. Number one, you gave a little story about the Celtic mythology.
Exactly.
And you're just talking about your Christian dogma, raised a Catholic. Pedro, I don't know if you can put up that Christian doctrine dogma graphic, but in there is Benjamin Franklin, who most people would consider a great intellectual. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a little, in fact, let me go right to it because I want to make the quote right. Ben Franklin said this, Tim. He said, "I found Christian dogma unintelligible. Early in life, I absented myself from Christian assemblies." So he looked at it that way. You look at it differently.
Well, I grew up in a different age than Ben Franklin. When I was in Catholic school, it was folk mass. It was lighting candles in class and Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell. And the nuns were shedding their habits and dropping out of the convents in droves. It was a very liberal, hip time to be a Catholic. Not that there aren't, parishes and churches that are more conservative and strict, like in Franklin's day. I would have a hard time, I think, in his day as well.
That's an honest statement right there. You talk about Mark, and Mark is your brother, or Julian's brother,
right,
who committed suicide. You keep referring to him as Mark died, Mark died, Mark died. I see an avoidance of the word suicide.
Yeah.
Did you also avoid thinking of your real, true brother's death as suicide? Did you avoid that thought?
I don't think I avoided it at all. People would ask me, how my brother died, and I would always say he took his own life. The word suicide, I think, has a lot of stigma attached to it. There's a certain shame attached to suicide. A lot of families try to hide it. I, from the beginning, was never going to be ashamed of my brother or anything that he did. He took his own life. He was having a difficult time, but it was a death nonetheless, and a very tragic and violent one. I don't think that I consciously avoid the word suicide, but probably subconsciously because
No,
of the
I
stigma
liked
attached
what you
to it.
just said. That distinction is fabulous.
Yeah.
He took his own life, and you mentioned that suicide has a stigma attached to it, and it does.
I mean, in
there's
certain
nothing-
cultures, you used to be ostracized.
And you don't want to
your whole family was ostracized.
Oh, of course.
If somebody took their own life.
But you are telling me that this whole journey in the book is to try truth, and it's like a spiritual soul search.
Absolutely.
So, and you're talking about the value of broken people.
Right.
Why would you stigmatize?
Exactly.
I mean, and that's the whole thing. We tend to stigmatize the homeless.
We do, absolutely. We stigmatize the homeless. We stigmatize addiction.
So it's words matter.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you say the same thing. He took his life.
Yeah.
Fine. You're not avoiding it. Interesting.
And it's funny that you refer to Julian as me, and you're not the only one that does that. Even reviewers have done that. This isn't an autobiography. I did, of course, draw on my own experiences, as all writers do. Mm-hmm. But Julian is not me, as I said before, I didn't, when my brother died, quit my job and go back to work at a shelter, although I wanted to. I had this desire to, and I had this desire to, shout to people, get it right. These things that you're worried about, these aren't crises. There are real things to be concerned about. When you go through a tragedy, your world is altered and your worldview is altered, and you try to reconcile that with the world around you. And it's very difficult because visually the rest of the world, hasn't really changed. It just looks different to you, and other people, don't see through the same lens.
There was a part when someone said, I believe it was Rosie, but I may be wrong. By the way, my favorite character, I want to get to that afterwards in your book. Too many bosses, too many laws, and every time there's a change in politics, they change the laws. Confusing.
Yeah.
And the key is the point, they treat us like children. Did you find, here you have all these rules in effect at the shelter, very strict rules, by the way. Were they treating them like children? These adults who had problems, were they treating them like children?
Well, I don't necessarily think that they are treated like children, but they are treated, but I can see why they feel like they're being treated like children, and it's humiliating to be an adult and to not be in control, right? And for this reason, many of the residents, personal rights was constantly an issue. I have the right to do this, we have the right to do that, so on and so forth. You and I in our everyday life, our personal rights aren't challenged and they aren't on the table, somebody who, has no home and has no property and has no job, how it's really in the forefront of their lives.
Yeah. So it's fascinating because being treated like children when you're an adult, you're right, is humiliating. You mentioned an alcoholic family, and I put a question mark. What is an alcoholic family?
Well, alcoholism can run through families. It doesn't have to specifically, but it quite often does.
My friend said it galloped through his.
Yeah, galloped.
Galloped through it, yeah.
I think that it's open for debate, and it's certainly a case-by-case issue of whether it's genetic or environmental. It's probably, like most things, a combination of both.
I tend to agree with you on that, Tim.
Two siblings can grow up in an abusive alcoholic home. One can wind up being abusive and alcoholic, and the other one cannot. I always say to people, your parents are your window to the world, and they teach you how to be in life, but they can also teach you how not to be. It depends on how you internalize it,
So an alcoholic family could be.
Could be, but if there's alcoholism in the family, then it's especially in more than one member.
Or whatever the addiction may be, by the way. For example, I was born with a deck of cards in my hand, and my father and my brother and my sisters and my cousins and my uncles all have a deck of cards in their hand.
Really?
So is it any wonder that I love the game of chance? It's just one of those things. Now, is it? Can you say that gambling is genetic? Maybe, but it certainly is environmental.
Maybe that addictive personality, because
that's it.
Yeah.
That's the key. Yeah. So it doesn't matter.
And the extremes to which you take it. Do you love to play cards all the time, or are you, blowing your mortgage and your kids, the point, college fund at Foxwoods?
But the point is, that's the thing that gets you from one place to another in this journey called life.
Right.
Some people use alcohol, some people use opiates, some people could use religion.
Yep.
So everybody has a certain mechanism by which they try to negotiate a very, very mysterious journey.
Yeah.
To which none of us have the answer, I don't think.
No.
Although you work at it. This book gives me a lot of insight. And folks, I'd advise you to take a peek at it. It's a great read. There was a section in there where this character Stanley, this big grappling man who apparently spent 12 years in prison, and you don't get into details, but you feared him for no reason other than the fact that he was in prison for murder. The circumstances of the murder were irrelevant to you. The fact that he did, you kind of moved away from him. But he had a seizure. And now you're forced to do something about the seizure. Well, this other guy's screaming all over the place, Samson, I believe.
Right.
And there was a myth about seizures that I found fascinating, about what you should and should not do. I'd like you to explain that to the audience.
Well, in the book, the character has a seizure, which happened from time to time due to withdrawal. And the character puts his wallet in his mouth so he doesn't swallow his tongue. And he does that because he always heard that you're supposed to do that. And then he wanted, it's, the entire book is a flashback. So in the narrative, he makes the note that, someone told him that, that in fact is a myth and that you don't need to do that.
You pry open a jar or something with your hand.
Right.
And what did the EMT tell you?
That, you shouldn't do that.
Why?
Because you could get bit.
Not only that they don't swallow their tongue in the first place.
They don't swallow their tongue in the first place, right.
So all of it is mythology. So for you folks out there, and I hope that never happens to you, right? I mean, that's not, it's a horrifying thing to have to deal with. In fact, your character ended up losing the tip of his finger as a consequence of it all.
Yep.
So beware the mythology of. I want to move over to a couple of things. If we can, bring up the street. No, I believe I like that New Age drunk talk. And I want to quiz you on some of these New Age drunk talk. And Pedro, is that up there? And there's a 500-pound hitchhiker. You ever hear that one? Or barfly fishing, pre-tarded, gang over, bar magnet, and on it goes. But some of these are really funny. Petting the bear. You have any idea what that means?
Not a clue.
No, I know. Neither did I. And so I'm going to hand this to you,
okay,
which are the definitions, and I'm going to ask you to let the folks out there know what petting the bear means in this New Age drunk talk.
Okay.
You see it down there? Petting the bear.
A pointed attempt to befriend an on-duty bouncer, especially as practiced in bars where violence is common.
I love that, don't you?
Yeah.
It's a good one. How about barfly fishing?
Barfly fishing. To make incessant cell phone calls to friends, insisting that they join you for a couple of drinks.
You got that?
Yeah, that reminds me of another new one, drunk dialing.
And?
That's, calling people, going home drunk and calling old girlfriends, etc.
And we'll go one more, and I find this swimming with sharks. I love that one.
Yeah, I think that was...
That's on the other page, I believe, yeah. Swimming with sharks.
Spalding Gray, I might have coined that phrase. That weird, out-of-kilter feeling you get when you're sober and surrounded by drunks.
That's a good one.
I can relate to that.
I think most people can.
Swimming with sharks, I would call that slipping out the door unannounced.
So did much of this, I mean, you build that into your story, that these folks did have their own language. The homeless people, drunks, have a language.
Right.
Basically what you're talking about.
Yeah, and also, here you have Rosie, who is an alcoholic bag lady, who is also very spiritual.
Yes, very.
And very wise. She has a lot of wisdom.
And employed. She's selling balloons.
She's selling balloons on the common.
She's an entrepreneur.
She's an entrepreneur. It keeps her in her wine.
Yeah.
But even despite her alcoholism and whatever damage has been done by booze and perhaps drugs over the years, she's still quite lucid, and quite spiritual in her so-called drunk talk.
And she's also a victim.
Yeah.
And I think we got to talk a little about that. Too often we push aside victimhood.
Yeah.
She had every intention to have a great life, married a guy who got addicted to heroin, had a child, and I never quite understood what happened to the child. And she had ambition, she had desire, but life, in a sense, victimized her.
Yeah.
And that's the luck of the coin, isn't it?
It is, and I think that it's up for debate too of whether she or we are victims of our lives or victims of ourselves, because I think, and I certainly don't put addiction on a moral level. You know, I don't judge people, but I think that we are truly victims of ourselves in a lot of senses, you know.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very easy to say, oh, you can stop that.
Right.
It's very easy to be judgmental.
Exactly.
But what I learned from this book, and I thank you for it, was a sense of compassion, because I have my own rough edges, you know.
Yeah.
I can be intolerant of certain behavior patterns because I don't understand them.
Exactly.
And thank you for enlightening me on that basis. Street smarts. I absolutely love, you mentioned it, the thinker?
Right, yeah.
Street smarts. And in order to survive in that environment, in the homeless world, you've got to be pretty sharp.
Exactly.
And Rosie was that.
Rosie was that too. And I think Samson was too in his own way. Obviously, you know, Samson was mentally handicapped.
Yes.
In some ways, it's not necessarily defined, but it's not really in life necessarily. He could navigate his way through the streets and these people, you know, in his own way.
But
the way that he could, you know, cajole a cigarette out of someone, or, you know, get what he wanted.
But he was actually a decent soul.
Yes.
Who talk about being victimized. And I'll leave you folks with a little hang there, so you read the story to find out about Samson. And the last element that you weave is insanity, so to speak, the ravings of a madman.
Right.
I think there were a couple of folks that bothered. There was one of your characters I absolutely had no respect for whatsoever, and he's the one that tattletaled on Samson.
Yeah, Winston.
He was despicable. Yeah. But I don't know if there were mad men or mad women per se, but I'm sure that there were people that had issues with mental
illness.
Yeah.
Well, I highlighted a few. The Andrea Alvarez.
Oh, I love that one. Yeah.
You know, the stewardess, and then the preacher, who is
I forgot that. Yeah.
Right. He's one of those characters that would be on the street corner, you know, preaching hell and brimstone and fire and so forth. The kind of person that you would walk by, and even if they were making a lot of noise, not really give much credence or attention to. But he, as well in the story, had insight into Julian and was very perceptive, and sort of connected his sermon under the stairs at the end to what Julian was going through.
Again, value.
Yeah.
Value.
Exactly.
Right. So we get to this point where he goes through the evening with episodes. He begins the evening with a very strict woman who everything by the book. I mean, she's the one that. And by the way, Julian was really kind of flexible.
Yeah.
He was situational ethics, so to speak. You know, what's
maybe a little even irresponsible, but
that's a good word. But irresponsible for the right reasons.
Right.
It was guarding the perimeters, but allowing people to be alive.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, that's noble.
Right.
And I suppose, was it Kyle who was the
director? Yeah.
He's the director of the whole operation, the minister.
Yeah.
He had a different role.
Right.
We don't get too much into it. Now, we have a few minutes left here before I have to go to my commentaries, but I'd like, Tim, to get to this addiction issue, because I think addiction is a big, particularly now with opiates.
Sure.
There's a definition about alcoholism that's up on the screen. It says alcoholism is the urge to keep drinking, is the first sign of an addiction. And it says you are not alone. I put a pretty picture up. I didn't put people that look like this, urinating on Union Street or something like that. I put a young man and a young woman profile drinking some nice wine, and that can lead to a terrible addiction.
Absolutely. Alcoholism, the spiral can be very slow, but then very fast too. There was a great quote from one of F. Scott Fitzgerald's short stories, which the character, I believe it's in Babylon Revisited, that short story, the character is an alcoholic, but he's referring to going broke and losing everything. But he lost everything due to his alcoholism and due to the market crash. But someone is in a bar and they asked him how he went broke, and he said, very slowly and then all at once.
That's a great.
Right, and I think that same could be, you know, for the downward spiral of an addict or an alcoholic. Things can slip away very slowly, relationships, responsibilities, possessions, and then all of a sudden it can all go down the drain.
F. Scott had that problem himself.
Exactly.
Pardon me. Despair. Despair leads to suicide.
Absolutely.
How many desperate people do you find? Is there desperation in a homeless shelter?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there's desperation in any form of addiction. Absolutely. You know, a lot of it is suppressed, you know, certainly by the substances by which they're, you know, self-medicating or pacifying. But I think there's a level of desperation in just about everyone.
Interestingly, Julian, I keep referring to you, Julian is looking for how he was a contributor to Mark's taking his life.
Right.
And he couldn't quite reconcile it. And one of my favorite characters I told you was Pam, who kept trying to tell him, you had nothing to do with it, get on with it, it was 11 months ago, get out of that shelter, do something with your life, go back to your job. She really means well, and one of the parts I like, was humorous about, and it's interesting, when she was 30 and had been married 3 times, and you make the comment, or the author, you, make the comment that she was a professional marriage person, and that's how she made her money. I mean, that's how she became affluent. But that journey that you have to take to sanity is wild. I lost my train of thought, folks. That's the truth of the matter. Now, lastly, homelessness. What we have up here is someone without socks, or with socks, but basically shoeless. That's what you see. And to see a young family, a woman with 2 young children with no place to go.
Yeah.
If that doesn't get you, something's wrong with you.
Right. You know, a lot of people, their knee-jerk reaction is to blame them and say, you know, well, how could you let yourself get here? How could you let your children live in an environment like this? You know, we live in a country where there's so much opportunity and there's so much freedom, and we can do whatever we want, but they don't understand, you know, the backstory. They don't understand addiction. They don't understand, you know, the choice. Right? Mm-hmm. There's a point in the book where Julian is explaining, you know, how he sort of gets the people at the shelter and why he had this need to be around suffering. And he said, because there was a time in my life before where I found myself in a place that I didn't choose, you know, but I created it, right? And he found himself now in a place that, you know, he didn't create and didn't choose, and he was completely bemused on how he was going to get himself out of it. But, you know, a lot of the people that live in places like this, you know, seemingly on the surface it could look like they created the hell that they're living in, but, you know, the choice was taken away from them, whether it was because of addiction or from outside sources.
I've always been amused that well-thinking people, well-thoughtful people around Thanksgiving time get all concerned about the homeless and feeding them and everything, and they give them all kinds of sandwiches and turkeys and the rest of it,
right.
And they don't realize they don't have stoves to cook them in. Right. They don't realize they don't have a refrigerator to put, and the beneficiary of their largest at that time are the ants that end up eating the leftovers because they can't consume it. So it's interesting the way we do things. I want to thank you, and I want to invite all of you folks to take a good look at Kissing the Hag on Amazon. Get a hold of it. If you need to get a hold of Tim for any reason, have any questions, be sure to
www.timothyquigley.org, and you can leave a message there that will go to my email. Sure, and Kissing the Hag is available on Amazon.com, and it's in all formats.
And you're not going anywhere because I have to read some comments. That's why.
And I've been doing a lot of book clubs, and if you wanted to choose this book for your book club, I would be happy to come on the night that you discuss it.
Oh, we'll
free of
tip you up on
charge.
that. Yeah. Let us know, and we'll get in touch with Tim. Hi, Joe and Paul. Hi, Tim. Another excellent program. I want to thank you for saying that. And on they go. They say, and here's what they have to say. They say, on the subject of Trump versus Clinton, there is much crosstalk between both camps of supporters with regard to Trump being unqualified to be president, or Clinton being unqualified to be president. The voters and the candidates as well must fully realize that the only qualification, Tim, for the office of President of the United States is very clear and accents that. In our Constitution, that of being the following: qualifications for President of the United States, age and citizenship requirements. U.S. Constitution, Article 2, Section 1. And that's about it. So all the stuff about qualifications is irrelevant. If someone wants to vote for you, they can vote for you. We talk about issues, and these things are created. So we'll get back to that.
Well, I mean, legally, that's what you need to run
Yeah.
for president. But I think in a democracy where we're voting in somebody, do you want to vote for somebody who's has experience, knowledge?
Depending on what that experience and knowledge is, because experience and knowledge can be not good.
Right.
So we have to qualify that. I'd like to also point out, let's see, we got one. I get this funny feeling when I see so many write-ins, and it has to do with double voting. And they question that, so that's interesting. We'll get into that when Paul comes back. And lastly, it's about, Paul apparently said at one time he felt embarrassed about being from Lynn, saying he was from Lynn. And then Paul clarified that, by the way, and says he loves Lynn, and not some same, I suspect. And this person wrote, I have only been in Lynn for 10 years, so my opinion is, from the outside looking in, may have more validity, I believe. Let me say one very positive thing about Lynn. The people who work at the various stores, banks, post office are the greatest, and on it goes. So this person is not ashamed, neither am I. I love Lynn. I love you being here, Tim, and I hope that you all get a hold of Kissing the Hag and maybe find the beauty inside all of the, what's that, mishmash that's happening in the world?
And the hideousness.
The hideousness of the world. That's well put. For all of us here at Lynn TV, have a great week.